We are live. Professor Tasmazevicius would like to give us the honor to start.
Okay, I'm going to speak in Portuguese, first of all, for our audience. Boa noite a todas e a todos. Nós temos a honra, né, e a alegria de receber no grupo de pesquisa de Direito Civil na Sociedade de Rede a presença do professor Posner, da Universidade de Chicago. O professor Posner, assim como seu pai, Richard Posner, desenvolveram essa metodologia muito interessante, que é o Law and Economics, que influenciou bastante o pensamento de vários estudantes, entre os quais eu. A minha tese de doutorado foi também com uma perspectiva econômica sobre o princípio da boa-fé, e então a gente tem essa honra, né, de receber um professor tão ilustre. Então, muito obrigado a todas e a todos que estão aqui acompanhando esta live. Thank you very much, Professor Posner. We're proud to receive you for this conference, and I'd like to thank you very much for giving us this conference and to having attended this invitation made by our students. It's very important to support students' initiatives to make projects and so on. Thank you very much for this evening. And welcome to the University of São Paulo. And who knows, you can visit us in a forthcoming year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I certainly hope I'll be able to visit you sometime, but this is the next best thing. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Bianca, microphone, please.
My God, sorry. Good night, Professor Posner. It's a great honor to have you with us today. And the first questions we want to make is that, as you know, many academics have been writing about the possible harms of AI, including its effects for democracy, data subjects, consumers, and the dangers of an after-the-fact regulatory solution. And on last April 21st, the European Commission presented the Artificial Intelligence Act, combining a risk-based approach based on a pyramid of criticality, a set of 4 risk categories with layered enforcement mechanism. So a lighter legal regime applies to AI applications with a negligible risk, and applications with an unacceptable risk are banned. Stricter regulations apply as risks increase. So do you think we should have an ex-ante regulation on the use of AI technologies, in particular in matters where redressing the costs of the AI would become politically and socially more difficult after a large-scale implementation?
Well, I think it's probably too early to start regulating AI, at least, you know, the technology itself. I'm sure that, at least in the United States, when AI is incorporated in a particular regulated product like a medical device, it's already regulated. But the question seems to be about the technology itself, and I gather that is what the European bill is intended to regulate. I think there are a lot of problems, at least at this stage of the development of AI, with implementing a regulatory regime. So first, AI refers to many different types of activities that overlap in complicated ways with just normal programming and data analysis. For example, one form of AI or machine learning simply involves training a computer to recognize, for example, objects. This is really just a form of data analysis. It's just a kind of statistical analysis that the computer does automatically. And it seems to me quite useful. And if there was some kind of regulatory regime that required, for example, programmers to obtain the approval of the government ahead of developing these sorts of systems, I imagine that would interfere with a great deal of perfectly ordinary programming and ordinary services. There are more worrisome forms of AI where, for example, a software program would in effect make a decision in place of a human being. So here, I think again, it depends. It just depends a lot on what type of decision. For example, if a software program could advise me on my finances, there already are documents I can read and people I can talk to who will advise me on my finances. I don't see, it just seems to me too early. Now, of course, there are very dangerous forms of AI, which at this stage I think are mostly speculative. And, you're right to wonder about the possibility that, after a large-scale implementation of AI, we will all regret that we didn't, try to regulate it ahead of time. I think that's just a kind of a generic risk with technology. All kinds of technological development has featured this type of risk, and sometimes technological development has produced very severe unintended consequences. But I do think that trying to regulate an activity before we actually know what it is would probably be unworkable, and if it were implemented in a rigorous way, would probably interfere with desirable forms of technological development.
I think in the States, there's an Algorithm Accountability Act that was proposed to the Senate, but I think it's less than the regulation in Europe. It's just more simple.
Yeah.
There's a growing concern about social inequalities in the context of cutting labor costs and wages in the US, and also in some other advanced economies in Brazil, all over. Also, there are several studies, both in economic and legal fields, about the growing problem of monopoly and cartelization in the States and all over the world, urging governments to do something about it. Last July, US President Joe Biden issued a new executive order in promoting competition in the American economy. And related to this, we've seen growing interest among academics, policymakers, and even the general public in the causes and effects of concentration in US labor markets, and on the effect firms with market power may have on wages and working conditions. You've addressed these questions in your recent book, How Antitrust Failed Workers. Do you think that antitrust is, in its current form, is equipped to address issues related to labor market power, or should antitrust prioritize worker over consumer welfare? Were they conflict, or do you see a conflict?
Right. So, yes, as you mentioned, I recently published a book on antitrust law and labor markets. And of course, you guys call it competition law in Brazil. Is that right? Most countries refer to competition law, but obviously they're the same thing. Now, so American antitrust law, which is, I think, fairly similar to the competition laws in other countries, does address labor market power as a matter of legal form. In other words, the statutes talk generally about markets and do not distinguish whether anti-competitive behavior has occurred in a product market, a labor market, or some other market. And so the United States Supreme Court, as early as 1927, recognized that the antitrust laws as they're written apply to labor markets. And that, in fact, involved a case in which employers of sailors had created an organization. Sorry, somebody just turned on my printer without asking me. Just turn it off. So in that case, a number of owners of ships had gotten together and fixed the wages of sailors, and the sailors brought a lawsuit, and the Supreme Court recognized that when employers collude to fix wages or to divide markets, that is a violation of American antitrust law. So the law clearly applies to labor markets. The real puzzle in American legal experience is that there have been very, very few cases like that. Only a handful, and the cases that have occurred have mostly involved sports leagues. So, for example, you have a bunch of teams, the baseball teams, basketball, football, or as you guys call it, soccer, or as you call it, football. You have a number of teams, and rules are put in place to prevent them from paying too much more to players than other teams, with the worry being, of course, that if one team in a very wealthy market can pay the players much more, that team will always win, and that will be very boring. So you have these public rules, which then be targeted by people who think that these leagues are violating the antitrust law. So there have been a few cases like that, but in the last, very few other types of antitrust labor cases. Until very recently, just over the last few years, the U.S. government and private litigators have begun bringing many more cases in response to recent economic research that has shown that labor markets in the United States are highly cartelized, very concentrated, and research has also shown that employers frequently engage in collusive activities to suppress wages. So, yes, the antitrust law is equipped to address issues related to labor market power, but there seem to be a number of subtle and complicated factors that deter private litigants from bringing cases. And so I do think the law probably needs to be reformed a bit to make these cases somewhat easier. The government should, for example, review mergers to determine whether a merger will have negative effects on labor markets. And that's something I argue, in this book and elsewhere. Now, your question about whether antitrust should prioritize worker over consumer welfare when they conflict, I think that the general rule in American law is that if, for example, a merger harms one market, the fact that another market, that members of another market might be benefit is not a defense. So if a merger would result in wages being suppressed and prices going up, and prices going down, normally that merger would be blocked. I think that's probably the right approach because it's simple. It's not really a matter of prioritizing worker welfare over consumer welfare. It's really just a matter of preventing employers from cartelizing any type of market. And for the sake of simplicity and enforceability, you try to constrain the analysis to just the market that's being harmed.
Great, Professor. Thank you.
Professor, when you wrote the article about the value of personal data, you lit me up. I already researched about data protection and how unfair it may seem to allow companies to use personal data without paying to the real owner. So when I read your article, everything made sense. I started to research the value of personal data information thanks to you. And now that's my thesis. I work with that in Brazil. So talk to you today is a giant honor. I'm so thankful to you and to your research. And obviously, I have a lot of questions. And especially what made you think to shift the view about the value of personal data, not only as a company asset, but as an individual, right?
Yeah, so there are two reasons for that shift. The first is that in the United States, and I imagine in most countries, the companies with data, with all the data, are generally enormous companies with massive market power. They have monopolies over the data. I mean, really, it's Facebook and Google mostly. And then, they sell data to people, and they're companies that aggregate data from different sources. So monopolies are inefficient. They're bad for the economy, they're bad for everybody. And Facebook and Google, one would expect as monopolists, would try to take data without paying people or paying as little as possible. But if you're not paying much for data, you're going to get low quality data or less data than would be optimal for the purpose of producing some kind of service. Now, there is another issue about whether we really want these companies to take people's data, but putting that aside for the moment, this is not a good way to organize the economy. It would be like having a single car company or a single steel company rather than competition. So that's the first. The second is one of equity and distribution. So, when people are online, it's a kind of a very interesting sociological phenomenon. Part of what's going on is they're consumers. They're using Facebook to talk to friends, so they're acting as consumers. But partly they're working. They're giving information, giving something of themselves to Facebook. Most people don't even understand this, I think, but a lot of us do. You're giving information about yourself, and Facebook is aggregating it. And Facebook is probably even more important than using. So Facebook uses the data for a lot of reasons. For example, in a lot of ways. For example, for targeted advertising. But probably more important than that is the machine learning. So, they'll use photos that we post and put labels on, and they'll train their algorithms on those types of photos. So you're really you're really generating something of value for Facebook. And as a matter of equity, you should be compensated for that. And in a world in which there's a kind of an increasing problem where people, as technology advances, don't even have skills to do any kind of work as they're being replaced by computer programs and robots and so forth. This is a way for some people to make money by providing information voluntarily to these companies in return for compensation. So you should have a better market in data and a more equitable distribution of wealth if Facebook and Google were required to pay people for their data, and to make this explicit, because otherwise people don't really understand that they have something of value to these companies that they're giving to them. And so, that was the motivation for trying to change the focus from an asset that, a firm just gets and is no big deal or is kind of ancillary to their business, to thinking of it as, a separate market where firms are obtaining something of value from people who don't understand that they're giving up something of value and without paying them for it.
Professor, we thank you so much. We are talking about the market, but sometimes governments do this as well. So how do you see the possibility of a state company to use personal information acquired from its citizens as an asset, even coming to sell data such as name, addresses, phone numbers, credit scores for advertisement purposes?
Yeah, so, we don't have state companies in the United States, so I haven't thought much about that. We do have the government, though, and the government does actually sell people's data, so, maybe surprisingly. For example, state and municipal and local governments will often obtain your data. When you apply for a driver's license, you give them data, and then they might turn around and sell some of that information to automobile dealers or insurance companies. And I think that's very unfortunate, and that the state should not be allowed to sell data. And the reason is that people don't have any choice. They have to deal with the state. So the state should protect people's data. Now, with a private company, I think it's more complicated because people have some choice over whether to buy services or interact with the private company. And if the company is required to be open and to disclose its use of data, I think it's less objectionable if people voluntarily contribute their data, as long as they know what they're doing, and as long as they're given an opportunity to negotiate for a fee for compensation of some sort.
Hi. You also leave me up with your article. As a journalist, I hope to be able to make some questions about some of your articles. One of them is the Facebook foreign disaster. You have explored the dark side of the Facebook for the project syndicate. We'd like to know your point of view about the social media inducting the market and the people. Could you share your opinion, please?
Sure. Well, I don't like social media, you know, to be frank, and I try not to use it myself. I think it has a lot of toxic effects on people. You know, in the United States, there have been controversies about social media now for many years, as I'm sure there have been in Brazil, about, you know, whether it causes mental illness in people. You know, it seems like often that, you know, people embarrass themselves, get themselves in trouble. You know, they don't really understand this technology very well. And I think a lot of people don't understand that if you say something just off the top of your head and it's posted on the web forever, it can come back and cause a great deal of harm. Now, my focus in this article, Facebook's Foreign Disasters, you know, I think, I mean, it's really quite astonishing how much harm Facebook has done in other countries. And you know, I don't think it's that particular problem has gotten as much attention in the United States as it should. So in some ways, you know, Facebook is so big, it's as though it has its own foreign policy, and that, you know, in a lot of countries, like in Myanmar, everybody uses Facebook, and so it's an incredibly powerful way for people to communicate their views, and and they can manipulate its algorithm in order to spread misinformation and hate speech that has actually very bad consequences. And one of the things that I find particularly objectionable about Facebook is that it doesn't have as many fact checkers, or, you know, it obviously doesn't pay as much attention to the misuse of the platform in foreign countries than it does in the United States. And, you know, obviously the reason for that is that it's an American company and it's vulnerable to regulation in the United States. So it has to pay attention to American public opinion. But in other countries, you know, it's much less vulnerable to regulation, except in, you know, very highly developed countries can regulate Facebook, but the vast majority of countries, less developed countries, they can't. They don't have any practical way. They don't have the capacity to regulate Facebook. And so, you know, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, sometimes excessively idealistic efforts by the United States to go into other countries and turn them, you know, try to introduce American institutions and ideals that are not necessarily appropriate for these countries. When the United States does this, it sometimes does it with very little thought or sophistication about how countries are very different from each other. And Facebook seems to be replicating this. I think, you know, the United States government seems to have learned its lessons after the foreign policy debacles in Afghanistan and Iraq, at least for the short to medium term. I think the United States will be more careful about going into other countries and trying to, you know, make them better places. But Facebook is not like that. You know, they're just making money.
I see.
You know, Facebook's executives, you know, don't live in these countries. They have subsidiaries, of course, who are more knowledgeable, but I don't think Facebook is providing a level of resources and sophisticated support so that its platform will be used properly in these other countries. So I hope that the American government will look into this and impose some constraints on Facebook. For example, require Facebook to use as many resources in controlling abuse of its platform in foreign countries as it does in the United States, at least in proportion to the population or something like that. And there are other things that the US government could do through law to constrain Facebook so that, it commits fewer foreign policy disasters. So, that's what I'd like to see, as soon as possible.
Oh, okay, I see. Also, David, on this article, what is the main fact and the consequences that social networks have on subjects, not only by collecting personal data, but by profiling and selling information for advertising?
Well, so when Facebook and Google sell information to advertisers, there are two schools of thought about this. One view sees this as a relatively harmless or even positive development. So, for example, if you're reading a newspaper or a magazine, you'll see all kinds of advertisements that are completely irrelevant to your interests. And this is a waste for you, and it's a waste for the advertiser. And I think the whole theory of targeted advertising was that when you're on the web, through profiling, through data collection and analysis, Facebook and Google can match you and an advertiser where, it's the type of advertiser whose products you might be interested in. So that's better, right? There's less of a waste of resources and time and so forth. On the other hand, so that's a possible view. I guess I see that as arguably there's some merit to that view, but I do think I certainly find targeted advertising a little disturbing personally, and I think a lot of people find it creepy. The way, for example, if you look at, a website about something that interests you, clothes or cars or what have you, that the brands that you visited are going to follow you around the web. I think this is something that people find disturbing for psychological reasons that aren't really very easy to explain, but it's just a fact that people don't like feeling that they're under surveillance and that they're being watched and monitored. And there's really no way to opt out of this system. Even if you're not on Facebook's platform, Facebook follows you around the web because it has other ways to access your information. And the same thing with Google. So we're all kind of trapped in this system of advertising surveillance. And I think it's probably unhealthy. And then, of course, there's the risk that the data will be used or purchased by organizations that are not just trying to sell goods and service to us, but are trying to manipulate us, trying to manipulate our political opinions or our political activities. And this I think, was the source of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. If a political party is targeting you, or a political campaign is targeting you, they may be able to send messages to you using the same type of service, advertising service, that will make you angry, that will rile you up, and that will mislead you. And the problem here is that, of course, this has always been the case, but the problem now is the more effective advertising is, the greater the danger on the political side that people will be manipulated. It doesn't seem like a terrible thing if you're manipulated into buying Pepsi rather than Coke, but if you're manipulated into supporting, a bad politician, that's something we all have to be concerned about.
Thank you. I'm very
Thank
honored.
you.
Professor Posner, I'm very honored to be here with you. I make Mariana's words mine. Your book or your work influenced my research, especially the book in Radical Markets. Mm-hmm. And
in that work, you raise an important question that I would like to ask you here today. In your opinion, what do you think of personal data processing as a competitive advantage?
Right. So, personal data processing is, something that's been around for centuries. It's just much more sophisticated now than it used to be. And I don't think, so are you talking about, for example, platforms like Google using their data in order to obtain a competitive advantage over their rivals? Yes. Okay. So I think that's troubling from an antitrust perspective. The problem is, of course, that the platform Google, let's use Google as an example. It already has a monopoly on search, right? So everybody's using Google for search, and if let's say, knows that a particular user might want to buy something, Google can, from the data that it obtains through search, Google can, for example, design its, shopping site, for example, to be more appealing to that person. And a competitor who doesn't have access to Google's data will then be put at a competitive disadvantage. And the problem there is that, this could be good in the short term, in the sense that maybe the shopper will have a better experience on Google's shopping site because of the information that the platform shares with the shopping site. But over the medium to long term, the problem is that Google shopping site would get such an enormous competitive advantage that will drive out of business the competitors, right? And I think that is an antitrust problem. We don't want a company with a monopoly over one service, in this case search, to be able to use that monopoly to obtain monopolies in other markets like shopping or travel or machine learning or whatever the other markets are. So what to do about this? So in Europe, the European regulators have addressed this problem much more forcefully than in the United States. Their competition law is somewhat more flexible, so that they can deal with what's called abuse of dominance relatively straightforwardly. In the United States, our antitrust law has weakened over the last few decades, and probably the traditional legal approach to this problem would involve what's called refusal to deal. If the platform refuses to share this data with competitors on, let's say, the shopping site or the travel site, then they would have an antitrust claim against Google. Courts have backed away from the refusal to deal claim over the last several decades because there's a kind of a general skepticism about the significance of this type of activity. But I think in the world of platforms, people are beginning to realize, certainly experts and scholars are beginning to realize, that the refusal to deal is a very powerful weapon for a platform. And, I think the US Congress and maybe the courts are going to gradually move toward enabling competitors to sue for access. And if not, just imposing some kind of regulatory system that requires these platforms to give access to their competitors.
Thank you, Professor. We have here a question from Professor José Eduardo Martins. We'd like to know how did you manage to solve the problem presented in the book Radical Markets on transferring real estates?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, sure. Did you manage to solve the problem presented in the book Radical Markets on transferring real estates?
I'm transferring...
Real estate.
Real estate. So I think, in radical markets, we use real estate as an example of our system of forced sales. This idea that if somebody owns real estate or land, and they have a monopoly, they have a kind of a monopoly, because land is not a commodity. All land is different, and so there's always this problem that real estate transactions are very difficult. If you own real estate, you have an incentive to set a high price if you want to sell it, higher than what most people are willing to pay, and that means it could take a long time before you find a buyer who's willing to pay that high price. And in the meantime, the real estate is not being used in its most efficient way. And drawing on work from other economists and other commentators and scholars, we argued that people should be required to announce their valuation of their real estate, let's say at the beginning of the year, and then the property tax would be based on that announcement. And then meanwhile, anybody who wants to buy your real estate could force a sale for that price. Now, this was quite controversial. A lot of people didn't like the idea that they could lose their houses to, a buyer. I think to some extent this rests on a misunderstanding, but I also understand that people have a kind of a psychological attachment to their homes. So in radical markets, we argued that this system should start with administrative property. For example, in the United States, most land is actually owned by the government, even in the United States, and it leases it out to miners and ranchers and farmers and so forth. And that might be a good place to test out this idea. But I think we're a long way, before this type of tax system would be acceptable to the public.
Great, Professor. Thank you. We would like to know, do you think that data protection laws have been effective in protecting consumers from invasive practice and even dark patterns, or consent ends up being a gateway for digital platforms to continue using data indiscriminately, considering that, as consumers, human beings, we have a limited rationality, bounded rationality, and cognitive bias?
Well, I mean, the data in the United States, I don't think, data protection laws are very weak, and they're kind of applied in very narrow circumstances. For example, your medical data is protected, so a hospital is not allowed to share it. But on the internet, it's the Wild West. These internet platforms and other internet companies can use your data however they want. They do, for increasingly in the United States, ask you if you are willing to accept cookies. I don't think that's going to protect people. I think most people just click on the button. They don't understand what risks they might be taking. Maybe they don't care. I think it's a little too complicated. Companies still kind of manipulate people with, pre-checked boxes and that sort of thing. I think it's going to be a long time until there's genuine data protection. I mean, even, when you think about it, for example, the companies that calculate people's credit ratings, like Equifax. I mean, these are very rich and successful companies with all kinds of resources, and they're still not able to collect people, secure people's data. They get hacked, and they make mistakes. They get hacked. Everybody's, social security numbers or credit card numbers are distributed onto the web. I think there's such a huge technological challenge, and that combines with people's, as you say, bounded rationality, their inability to, use strong passwords or to remember their passwords or to avoid taking shortcuts that put them at risk. So I think we have a long way to go before we would really have an effective data protection regime.
So, and do you think that the regulation of digital platforms should follow a kind of whole of government approach with cooperation between antitrust, data protection, and consumer protection agencies, or maybe even with the creation of a digital unit that would integrate these competences, as has been suggested in many of the reports on competition in digital markets, like the Stigler report and the Furman report, the Coyle report. Would like to know your opinion about that.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there's a problem of overlapping jurisdictions. We already have consumer protection agencies in the United States. There's a Consumer Financial Protection Agency. There's a Consumer Protection Agency. There are all kinds of, there's the FTC, which, is supposed to protect consumers. And if we created another kind of consumer data protection agency, we're just going to have a mess of agencies interfering with each other. I can imagine an agency that is an expert on data on the internet that could maybe advise the other ones. But I think the way, the U.S. regulatory system is structured currently, it would probably create a lot of confusion if there were an agency that was devoted to protecting consumer data. I do think, Congress has to do something. I mean, it has to enact some laws that more directly address this problem, but those laws would confer authority on, I think, whatever agencies happen to be relevant. So if people's data is being, let's say, misused by financial institutions, that's something that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau would address. And if people's data is being misused by, let's say, political parties, that's something that the Federal Election Commission should address, and so on.
So, Professor, in your opinion, how can data breach affect human rights in countries with political and ethical persecutions often happen? And how can we act to protect these people?
So, so this has happened, right? That Facebook or these other companies, Twitter, give people access to their platforms with promises of anonymity. And then they're either hacked or there's a famous incident involving Twitter where I think it was the government of Saudi Arabia had an agent at Twitter, or a national at Twitter, and they were able to obtain information about a dissident through Twitter. So, that's a serious problem. And currently, the U.S. government, where most of these companies are located, doesn't really impose any obligations on these companies to maintain anonymity. Now, the companies usually want to, right? That's part of their appeal. So they're going to put some effort in protecting people's anonymity when anonymity is a part of the platform. But, it's very hard to battle against state actors, for example, and sophisticated hackers. So what can we do about it? Well, I do think that the U.S. government should require these firms that make promises of anonymity to put serious resources into keeping those promises and to penalize them if they fail. I think that's one thing that could be done. I'm not sure whether it's that useful to think of data protection as a basic human right. I mean, I tend to worry that human rights language may sometimes interfere with the careful analysis of the complicated trade-offs that are always involved. I mean, people do benefit a great deal by sharing their data with these companies. And at the same time, there's a big risk of abuse. And so what I'd like to see is the government stepping in and issuing regulations that deter let's say, the companies from giving inadequate protection to people's data.
Professor, what do you think about data trusts as a way to mitigate the anti-competitive effects on digital platforms?
What are data trusts?
Data trusts are kind of trusts that people will give their data, and then this trust would administrate the data to foster competition, because they will give the data to many companies, even the smaller ones, and so it would address the anti-competitive problems of digital platforms.
I see. Yeah, so in radical markets, we advocate data unions, which sound a little bit similar. I think the challenge here, so the idea is similar, which is that you give people more control of their data and you increase their bargaining power by enabling them to basically contract with the companies through an intermediary that will serve their interest. So for example, if, the way we think about it is, maybe you're a customer of Facebook, but when you send data to Facebook, it goes through an intermediary, which could be a union or a trust or some entity. And that intermediary would have the power to basically impose a boycott on Facebook to halt the transmission of data if Facebook abuses people's data. And because the intermediary would be aggregating the data of a large number of people, it would have bargaining power. It would have the credibility with Facebook. And so it could represent the interests of all of its members, and in that way, force Facebook to make concessions. And those concessions could be protections, or they could be money. They could use the threat of a boycott in order to force Facebook to pay them. And in addition, the trust idea is also interesting. What you said is that it could make the data available to other companies, to smaller companies, and a union could as well. And so, for example, the trust or the union could say to Facebook, look, if you don't improve your data protections or pay users more money for their data, we're gonna send people's data to other places, to other companies. So I think the idea is a good one. The question is just, will it work? Is this technologically feasible? Will people be willing to entrust their data to this entity, which could itself abuse the data, right? So there's always this problem of using intermediaries, which is that they might just add frictions and costs and risks that wouldn't otherwise exist, and could simply be confusing for people. I mean, real unions, they work hard to obtain the loyalty of their members, and people have a kind of a personal relationship with their union. They know the union steward, they identify with the union, and it's not entirely clear that can be replicated when people are just sort of sending their data anonymously across the internet. But I do think that these ideas are good ones, and that they hold some promise for dealing with some of the problems that we have with the current status of data protection.
You showed us, I think, a data union site when we were in Chicago, and I always put this in my presentations because I think it's quite disruptive.
Yeah, and there also, I was contacted, by the way, recently by someone who was just an executive in a private company, and this is a for-profit company, but they have a kind of a similar idea that they can serve as intermediaries between people and the other companies that use data, and sort of simplify things, explain things, pay people. So this idea is kind of floating around, and the hard question is always how you put it into practice.
Pietra, do you want to ask a question?
It's Lívia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lívia, you are muted. So I'm going to do the question.
Okay, it's me now. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So you wrote for the New York Times about addressing monopoly with antitrust law. Your article starts with the phrase, the spectacle of the antitrust challenges to big tech has been reviving. Could you explain for us how it works?
How the challenge to big tech works, or how using antitrust law to address monopsony?
I believe the how to address it. The
monopsony. Yeah. So I mean, just to be clear, in the United States, as I'm sure in other countries as well, people are debating whether the big tech companies should be subject to regulation or, whether they violated the antitrust laws. In the United States, there have been lawsuits brought against them by the government. Of course, in Europe, lawsuits have been brought more successfully by the European Commission against the big tech companies. And I think people are, riveted by this spectacle because we interact with the big tech companies all the time. And, companies like Facebook have been involved in one scandal after another. So the public, wants to see something happen. But at least in the United States, it's going to be tough to at least radically change the current system through antitrust law, because, while it seems quite likely that a number of these big tech companies have violated the antitrust law, the remedy is going to be fines. They're going to pay a bunch of money, but they have a huge amount of money. So they'll pay the money and they're not going to really change their behavior. That's why some people want to break up the big tech companies. And, I think that's probably not likely. I don't think courts will order a divestiture as a remedy. But it's possible. But even if it does happen, I suspect things won't change that much. If Instagram and Facebook are different companies, it probably won't be that different. People's everyday experience won't be that different. So I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I think there's a limit to what can be done about the big tech companies. I think it's just the world we live in now. They're going to be these very large companies because of the nature of platforms. The network effect that platforms take advantage of favor companies that grow very rapidly and very large. And, companies that grow very rapidly, they're often actually not that well managed, because they grow so rapidly. The people who are really smart and have a good idea are not necessarily the same people who can manage a company with tens of thousands of employees and millions or even billions of customers. So it's a kind of a mess, but it's also hard to know what the law can do about it. And so what I was trying to say in this New York Times article is that I actually think the more radical change in markets in the United States and in antitrust law will be related to labor markets rather than big tech. And the reason for that is that labor markets have been neglected by antitrust authorities for so long, and the anti-competitive behavior in labor markets is so, ubiquitous and significant. And the government is waking up to this fact. So I think there will be a lot more activity. I think Congress will pass laws. The regulators are going to bring more lawsuits. Private litigants will bring more lawsuits as well. And so we may well see a lot of changes in how labor markets work in the United States.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to ask you, as you discuss in your book, Radical Markets, if the internet starts to pay for our data, how will that change our society? And even, how do you think companies will set that price?
Yeah. So it could happen in a number of ways. Companies could voluntarily pay people, and you probably need a payment system of some sort that is cheaper than what we have in the United States, at least now, like cryptocurrency maybe. But basically, you could have an account with Facebook, and every time you use Facebook and you give them information, they could simply send money to your account. I mean, I think technologically that wouldn't be very difficult. Now, the question is, what would cause them to do this or to pay you, a reasonable amount of money? And that would require either a trust or a union or some other intermediary, or maybe even government regulation to compel Facebook to do that. Now, your question is, what would happen at that point? Would life change? Well, I think, at a minimum, people who spend a lot of time on the internet would make some money off of it, which is probably a good thing. I think, I think this will tend to help lower income people. People one of the reasons why we talk about data as work, people have a lot of knowledge. They have a lot of local knowledge. So even people who don't have a lot of skills, who, haven't been educated, they know a lot. They know a lot of cultural aspects. They know, they have linguistic knowledge. They know the area in which they live. And this information can be useful to people, useful to advertisers, of course, but also useful to businesses, and they should pay for it. So in other words, there's a kind of people have assets that they don't know about, which is their knowledge about how their part of the world works. So they'll give that information in return for money. They'll be better off as a result. And I don't know, I think, maybe targeted ads will be even better, which may not be so great, but, maybe it won't be such a bad thing. Or maybe language translation software will be better. We talk a little bit about this in the book, so the translation software has gotten a lot better over the last few years, but it's still, not very good. It's better to be able to speak to someone in that person's language than to use a translator. And the reason why it's not that good still is that language is so complicated. People speak in idiomatic ways. They have different accents. Language is constantly changing. And there isn't enough data, really, for the AI to be able to produce translations that would be, idiomatically correct and elegant and fluent. But if better data was produced, the translations would be better, and maybe that would enable people to speak to other people who don't speak their language, in a kind of a fluent way, the way we're speaking to each other now. So that could be quite beneficial. But I don't see a radical change in behavior. I see an incremental, but good change. A little bit more money for lower income people, and somewhat better products for everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Eduardo, would you like to do any questions?
Yes. We have now about 100 people watching you, and some of them are saying hi to you, Professor Posner, your former Brazilian students. My question is the following. I'm a private law professor. My PhD thesis was about asymmetric information on contracts. And since 2014, I decided to study personality rights and privacy law questions. And I'm very concerned about the future of our freedom and privacy. I'd like to know your opinion whether, for example, scientists have told warning people Earth doesn't support anymore the intensive use of natural resources and to create economic growth. In your opinion, is it happen the same with data, the use of data or even what would it be the break-even point, or would it be the limit to make excessive data use? Are you concerned about it? Would you think that privacy would be an old-fashioned concept, or even freedom could disappear in our Western world?
Well, I think over the long term, one should worry about those sorts of things. I don't see this as an immediate threat, but I do share your concern about the longer term. But if, the problem is, of course, is that I think it's possible for people in the government to adjust to new problems. And we see this, you mentioned natural resources, very slowly the world is very gradually seems to be willing to address climate change. And, if you go back to 100 years ago or 50 years ago, people were extrapolating from current trends and they would say, look, the oceans will be dead. There'll be no more forests. The air pollution will be terrible. And people took, governments and the public took those warnings seriously, and they passed laws to address those problems. And some of those laws have been pretty successful. So I think I'm reasonably optimistic. And in any event, pessimism, isn't going to get you anywhere. What I think will happen is that, first of all, that yes, the acquisition of data analysis will continue to grow. I am not sure it will result in a significant loss of privacy, because I do think that the government can probably regulate the amount of data and how the data is used by companies. So, for example, even with targeted advertising, even though it's creepy, it's not really, revealing to the world, your personal preferences. Like if I'm on the web and I get an ad for something that's, I don't know, embarrassing because, I've been to a website that's embarrassing. Like, I get the ad, but people around me, my friends, my family, my colleagues, they don't know about this. So as long as this type of information is regulated and used in a careful way, we're not necessarily going to lose privacy. And, this has been going on for a long time. So if you think about it, your data, information about you is already, has been, out there. Like, for example, hospitals you've gone to have all the information about your medical history, your credit history, banks have information about your credit history. The government has information about your taxes, how much you make. All this information about people is already out and has been, recorded and maintained in data repositories for many decades. And, most of the time it doesn't get out. And when it does get out, it gets out in this kind of indirect way. It's used for advertising, but not necessarily, but not to tell the whole world what your income is, for example, or whether you have a genetic disorder. I think so it's certainly possible to regulate information and to maintain people's privacy while at the same time making that information available to the appropriate authorities so that they can, collect taxes, for example, or give you medical care. The problem now is just that because of this rapid development in technology, it's become much, much easier and cheaper to collect data on people and to aggregate it and to store it in on the web, where hackers and foreign governments or your own government might have access to it. And, I guess I think that because this is such a risk to people's privacy and even their freedom, there's going to be a lot of pressure to improve protections. Some of that pressure will come from the private sector. There are ways that you can protect your information about you if you're willing to pay someone, with a password manager or what have you. And so the private sector understands that people want privacy, and they're developing tools for people to protect their privacy. But really, the government has to be involved, because the government itself has a lot of information about people, and the government is the only entity with the power to, prevent private actors from abusing the information they obtain from you. Now, as long as the government is democratic and, reasonably responsive to public opinion, I think, we could expect it to improve the law. I think the really scary possibility is that authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments, which, already exist in many countries, and, there's this kind of democratic slide in a lot of democratic countries. So there is the worry that the government will use this information. And, if it does, right, there is the nightmare of the totalitarian society that Orwell wrote about it in 1984. But, I don't see that happening in the United States, for a while. It could happen, but I don't really know what we can do to prevent it from happening if it does. I think we'll just have to wait and hope for the best and advocate for better regulation and more types of privacy controls.
Thank you, Professor Posner. As Professor Posner is internationally known, we just forgot to formally introduce you. I'm sorry. So he's the and an Elas Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Arthur and Esther King Research Chair. And of course, everybody knows that his research includes financial regulation, international law, constitutional law. He has written many books in many fields, including recently published How Antitrust Failed Workers, as we talked about the book, Radical Markets, and Last Resort, the Financial Crisis and the Future of Bailouts. Professor Posner, we want to thank you very much again for accepting our invitation. Having you today was just a wonderful opportunity for all of us and for the university. And we really hope to see you soon in a live event in Brazil or in Chicago, not only online events, okay? So
okay, yes. Yes, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this invitation, and I've enjoyed your excellent questions. So this has been fun, and hope to see you sometime in Brazil.
Thank you, Professor. Now I'm going to speak in Portuguese for everyone.
Okay.
Pessoal, muito obrigada por terem vindo. Hoje nós recebemos o professor Eric Posner, que é professor da Universidade de Chicago. Ele pesquisa sobre regulação, antitrust, direito constitucional e proteção de dados. Como vocês viram, ele é um autor de muitos livros, muitos textos que foram extremamente importantes para nós em toda a nossa pesquisa. De professora Eduardo Tomazevicius, Pietra, Bianca, para mim, o que a gente pesquisa sobre ele é imenso. Eu recomendo que vocês vão atrás, porque é um achado atrás do outro. Então, muito obrigada por terem acompanhado, muito obrigada pela audiência hoje, que foi incrível. E agora eu volto, professor, em inglês de novo. So, Professor, I'm really honored, and I can say for us all, to talk to you today. And so, thank you.
My pleasure.
Good night, everyone. Okay. Boa noite, pessoal. Okay. Vamos lá.
Thank you.
Boa noite a todos.
Boa noite,
Bye.